Okay, so this is going to be picking up our Cold War and with Europe and the world. We'll start with the space race. So the space race is part of this competition. It's part of the Cold War competition. Since they can't shoot at each other, they're competing. Who's got the better system? Who's got the better scientists? And really, for most of the Cold War, for most of the space race, the Soviet Union was ahead. They launched the first satellite, the first lunar flyby, the first person in space, the first spacewalk. Really, the United States was a step behind the Soviet Union for the entirety of the space race until the very last, until we launched and landed men on the moon and got them back safely. That was a key part of it there, too. And so that kind of unofficially ends the space race because that was the big goal. And once the U.S. achieved that, there was no sense in continuing spending that money there, or at least the powers that be saw it that way. One thing, too, about the space race, just to remember that it's very much tied to the arms race, because if you're launching these things, if you're launching satellites, if you're launching people, you could be launching warheads also. So the space race is very closely tied with the arms race. Next, we've got a big old slide here. This one, there's a lot of heavy lifting here. So we're going to talk about proxy wars and Cold War conflict, basically from 45 to 80, as it says there. So to start with, there's a lot of anti-Soviet rebellions in Europe in the 50s. There's one in Hungary. There's one in Czechoslovakia. And so both of those places so there's Hungary, Czechoslovakia, had anti-Soviet rebellion. So these countries that were being dominated by the Soviet Union, they wanted more freedom. They wanted more autonomy. We also have a whole series of proxy wars. So a proxy war is when our allies fight the Soviet Union, or their allies fight us. So our allies fight the Soviet Union, or their allies fight us. Now, the reason it's a proxy war is because if they fought head-to-head, what potentially could happen, nuclear war, mutually assured destruction, all kinds of badness. So we would fight Soviet allies, they would fight our allies. There's a series of them. The first one happens just 5 years after World War II. That's the Korean War. So that's a proxy war. Then from 1946 to 75 is in Vietnam. It's labeled here Indochina. One thing that I want you to know is that it started first as France fighting the war, and then it became the United States. That war was closely related to decolonization, getting the French out of there. And then the Soviet Union's big proxy war was from 79 to 89, and that is in Afghanistan, where we supported the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, against the Soviet Union. There was all kinds of non-aligned nations. So those are the countries that are not allied with the United States and the West or the Soviet Union. There was a lot of competition for those non-aligned nations. And then lastly, there's also a lot of conflict in Latin America. Soviets wanting to get involved in Latin America, us not wanting that because they're in our backyard. And also in Cuba, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I have this under Latin America, which is the closest the world has ever come to, nuclear annihilation, or at least purposeful nuclear annihilation. The Soviet Union was building missiles in Cuba, and we did not like that because we don't think anybody should have missiles that close to us, even though we have missiles close to them. But, we wanted different rules. But anyway, and so there was a standoff where both sides, Soviet Union and the United States, were basically sitting ready to launch when ultimately the Soviet Union backed down. And so we avoided nuclear annihilation. So that was nice. The next development to talk about, so we already had a military alliance in NATO. We already had a peaceful United Nations that's supposed to help keep peace and security. But Europe needs some more, and so this is going to be the creation of the European Union. So essentially, a whole bunch of European states, it starts just in Western Europe, start to band together economically to try to remain relevant. To try to remain relevant. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's get into the answer here. So the first reason they need to do this is because they want to make up for a loss of empire. Okay, England, France, even Spain to a certain extent, they are losing their empire during decolonization. And little old England here, even little old France, they can't compete with the United States, economically speaking. France is roughly the size of Texas, to put that into perspective. Illinois is bigger than Ireland. And they can't compete. And so what they are going to do is they're going to come together economically. So instead of operating as France and as Germany and competing with each other, they're forming this union that they're all working together. Okay, so the reason they're doing this is to make up for the loss of empire, which is what I have for one. Number two, to try to match the United States. And number three, to try to bring Europe together. They've spent the last half century fighting each other and killing each other, and now they're going to come together. They're going to work together. The arrow I have down here is it was very successful. We'll look at some data about that in a moment here. So it was very successful. So this is the evolution of growth in several countries. The United States is in blue. The light green is Western Europe, which essentially is the European Union for our conversation. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to write down next to this slide one conclusion you can draw from this data. Okay, what is one conclusion? And don't just be like, the U.S. had more than everybody. I know. That is what the data shows. That's what the graph shows. I want you to make a conclusion about that. So go ahead, write down a conclusion. Okay. Next set of data that we're going to look at is GDP per capita. So that's, again, gross domestic product, basically how much money the country has. Per capita means divided by how many people they are. And so this is going to show the US and then the Soviet Union, Russia, the former Soviet Union. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the United States and the Soviet Union were never in direct economic competition. They were kind of in two separate realms. But so from 1945, so from World War II right here, forward is the Cold War. What conclusions can you draw here? Once again, let's write one conclusion down. I'm actually going to pause so then you can pause your screen and write your conclusion down. So again, Cold War is what we're talking about. So from 1945 on. Okay. Next, we're going to look at this map. During the Cold War, we referred to countries as first, second, or third world countries. First world was basically the US and Western Europe, or Western allies. But you'll see Japan is included in that as well, as is South Africa, basically because of its European connection still. Second world countries was the industrialized socialist states. So basically the kind of the communist world. So you have the entire Soviet Union, you have the Eastern Bloc, and then you have the stands as well as China, Cuba. And then third world countries were essentially um, poorer countries. Oftentimes they were non-aligned countries as well, not in the alliance with the US or the Soviet Union. Most of them had a colonial background in one way or the other. They're also called developing countries at times. Um, and so that was how we kind of divided the world up in the during the Cold War. By the time we get to the end of the Cold War in the 90s, we start talking about the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. In the early 2000s, people saw this as the economic up and comers, excuse me. They were where the biggest growth was going to come. They were going to be, um, well, and like I say here, the prediction then was that by 2050, they would dominate the globe. These BRIC countries would economically dominate the globe. Now we're obviously about halfway there to 2050, and while China is certainly stepping up and is in a strong second place behind the U.S. economically speaking, I think it's safe to say Russia, India, and Brazil have not been following that same path. Um, so actually look at some data here. I want you to look this over. Um, Give you a minute here to look this over. I'll pause. Okay, once again, I want you to write down some conclusions here. So there's a whole bunch of data here that you can look at. You can see that the one chart actually added South Africa into the acronym, the BRICS nation. And so again, remembering that GDP is gross domestic product. I want you to go ahead and just write some conclusions. What do you see? What is this telling you? What do you think the future of the BRIC or BRICS countries are? And then jot that down, and then you'll pick up on the assignment for the rest of the day, the political cartoon assignment, and we will keep on keeping on. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you for keeping up with this. Later.